He caught her arrow midair, and now she must marry him, and now there is no refusal. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun was sinking behind the canyon when Colt Mercer guided his horse along the narrow trail that curved between two tall stone walls. The light had thinned to a dull orange, the kind that made the land look older and harsher. Colt sat straight in the saddle, shoulders squared, his coat pulled close against the cooling wind. His horse moved at a steady walk, hooves striking firm earth with a rhythm he had grown used to over years of riding these borderlands. Colt was 38, a man who had spent most of his life working cattle, scouting trails, and dealing with trouble when trouble came looking. He had once ridden with other men, shared fire pits, taken jobs that required quick thinking and a steady hand. Those days ended after a shootout left two of his closest partners dead, a mistake he replayed in his head more often than he admitted. Since then, he kept to himself. He built a cabin away from towns and lived a routine centered on survival, work, and silence. Tonight, he was returning from checking a line of traps he kept near the creek. Nothing unusual had happened during the day, but a familiar tightness had formed in his chest the moment the canyon shadows grew long. He trusted his instincts more than anything else. When something felt wrong, it usually was. He slowed the gelding to a careful trot. The canyon walls had been warming all day, and the cooling air made small pockets of sound echo strangely, wind slipping between tight cracks, loose stones shifting without clear cause. Colt listened with focus sharpened by years on the frontier. His jaw tightened as he scanned the rocks above him. The landscape was open enough to see movement, yet cramped enough for someone to hide if they knew where to stand. A faint scrape came from the ridge to his right. He stopped the horse instantly. His hand hovered near his holster, though he didn't draw the gun. Drawing too early got men killed as often as waiting too long. He held his breath and let his eyes adjust to the dimming light, looking for anything that didn't belong. That was when he saw it, the brief shift of a figure behind a jagged outcrop, a movement so slight most riders would have missed it. Colt didn't speak. He didn't move. He waited with the same patience he used when watching a wounded animal decide between fight or flight. A bowstring twitched. An arrow shot downward. Colt reacted before he consciously understood the threat. His hand came up fast, palm open, fingers closing around the shaft with a tight snap that stung the skin between his thumb and forefinger. His horse startled beneath him, but he steadied it with a firm pull of the reins. The arrow felt light, but solid in his grip. Feathers brushed his knuckles, and his pulse thumped once, heavy and controlled. His breathing stayed even, but the tension in his back tightened. That was no warning shot. Someone had meant to hit him. A woman rose from the rocks. She stood with her shoulders angled defensively, half leaning against the stone as though her legs fought to stay upright. Colt saw the strain in her arms and the tremor in her hands. Her long black hair stuck to her face, and her deerskin dress clung to her frame in places torn from travel or struggle. Her skin showed bruises along her upper arm. She was exhausted, so exhausted she struggled to keep her bow lifted. Her eyes locked onto the arrow in Colt's hand, widening with shock rather than anger. Her expression changed from fear to dread, something deeper and more personal than simple regret over a failed attack. Naya had lived her life inside Apache traditions that carried strict, weighty rules. One of them involved this exact moment. Colt didn't know the details yet, but she clearly did. Her knees weakened, and she caught herself with a rough breath. Colt kept his voice calm. "I don't mean harm." She didn't answer. Her thoughts ran quickly behind her eyes, trying to measure distance, assess the threat, and decide whether another shot would matter. When she realized she had no strength left to fire again, her bow dipped. Naya was around 25, raised in a family that had been fractured by raids and tribal disputes. She had spent weeks moving across the land, trying to outrun danger she never asked for. Her mission had been simple: survive long enough to reach her sister's camp farther east. Now, cornered in a canyon, she had fired in fear, not aggression. She hadn't expected a stranger to catch the arrow. She whispered something in Apache, voice tight and strained. Colt didn't understand the words, but he understood the fear. He lowered the arrow slowly, not tossing it aside, not raising it. He let her see he wasn't claiming anything with it. His steady movements helped ease the tension, but her breathing stayed sharp. Naya stepped forward, then stopped halfway down the rocks. The limp in her left leg became visible, proof she had been injured before their encounter. She looked behind her again, scanning the empty ridge, making sure no one followed. Whatever danger chased her hadn't disappeared. She needed shelter, but she didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. Colt weighed the situation. This wasn't a robbery attempt. This wasn't a woman looking for trouble. This was someone running out of options. "You're hurt," he said quietly. Still no answer. "You can walk to the cabin," he added, voice even. "It's not far." She hesitated, unsure if she should believe him. She didn't know if he would use the arrow against her, or if he even understood what he held. But her legs trembled under her, and the sky had gone darker. Night in the canyon meant cold air, difficult footing, and no chance of safety. She made a decision. She took one step, then another, keeping several paces between them. Colt didn't look back to check on her. He rode ahead at a slow pace so she wouldn't think he was trapping her. His thoughts shifted from confusion to calculated concern. If she collapsed, he would have to carry her. If someone was hunting her, they might already be within range. The risk didn't bother him, but the uncertainty did. By the time they reached the cabin, the first stars had appeared. The structure stood quiet against the landscape, smoke from the earlier fire no longer visible. Colt dismounted and opened the door, stepping aside. He wanted her to see he wouldn't block her escape. Naya entered cautiously. She inspected every corner before stepping fully inside. Only then did she relax her arm enough to lower her bow. Colt placed a lantern on the table and lit it. Warm light spread across the small room, showing the rough bed, the shelf of tools, the stove, and a single chair pulled close to the table. He set a tin cup of water and a piece of bread on the table. Naya watched his every movement, waiting for a trick that never came. "You can stay here tonight," he said. Her stomach tightened, not from distrust, but from hunger she had been ignoring for too long. She approached the table slowly and touched the cup as though checking whether it was a trap. When nothing happened, she drank carefully. Colt removed his coat and hung it on a peg. He sat at the edge of the bed, watching her in short glances rather than full stares, knowing constant attention would make her feel cornered. She settled near the door, choosing a place where she could defend herself quickly if needed. As the fire warmed the cabin, Colt studied her posture, the bruises, the way her fingers wrapped tightly around the bow, even when she closed her eyes. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know why she fired at him, or why catching the arrow had shaken her more than missing the shot. But he understood one thing with complete certainty. This woman wasn't just afraid of him. She was afraid of something much bigger, something still out there. And by letting her through his door, he had stepped into it too. Morning crept into the cabin as a pale stripe of light pushed through the single window, settling across the wooden floorboards in a slow, uneven pattern. Colt opened his eyes to the familiar creak of the stove cooling from the night's fire, the faint sound of wind pressing against the outer wall, and the soft rustle of movement near the door. Naya was already awake. She sat cross-legged, her back straight despite the fatigue still evident in her eyes. She had kept the bow beside her through the night, one hand resting lightly on the wood, as if touching it allowed her to stay alert. Her expression was sharp and focused, but her shoulders carried a stiffness that came from long days of travel, hunger, and fear she had trained herself not to show. Colt didn't speak right away. He stood slowly, giving her a chance to adjust to the shift in space. She watched him with careful precision, reading every small movement as though preparing for a sudden change. When he poured water from the jug into a tin cup, she didn't look away. "You need more than a few sips," Colt said quietly. She accepted the cup, drinking with controlled, even gulps. When she finished, she placed it on the table and pointed at his coat, where the arrow he caught now rested in a pocket. Her face tightened, not with anger, but with a kind of heavy recognition. She stepped forward, tapped the coat once, then drew a shape in the dust on the floor, two stick figures, one holding an arrow, the other standing uninjured. Colt watched the drawing form. She worked slowly, making sure he understood the seriousness behind her actions. Then she raised her hand, pointed to herself, then to him, and lowered her eyes with reluctance. "What does that mean?" he asked, his tone steady. Naya pressed her fingers together in a gesture that resembled a binding. She then shook her head and touched her chest, conveying reluctance rather than acceptance. She wasn't happy about what the tradition demanded. She wasn't choosing it. It had simply happened. Colt's jaw tightened. His instincts were already telling him this was bigger than simple misunderstanding. "You think I claimed you," he said. She nodded once, small, tense, unmistakable. Colt exhaled slowly, trying to sort the situation with the same calm he used when dealing with hostile men or rattled horses. He crouched down and wiped away the drawing, so she wouldn't have to keep staring at the mark that frightened her. "I'm not taking you as property," Colt said. "You're not bound to me. Not in any way you don't want." Naya's eyes flickered with confusion. Kindness from strangers was rare, especially when sacred rules were involved. She stepped back as if unsure whether to believe him. Then she touched her ribs, lifting the edge of her dress slightly to reveal a dark, spreading bruise. Colt froze, not because he was shocked, but because she was trusting him enough to show where she hurt. He didn't ask how she got it. He knew better than to force explanations. Instead, he pointed to the chair and stepped aside. She hesitated, then sat carefully, holding herself upright so the bruise wouldn't press against the wood. Colt prepared a small meal, beans warmed over the stove, a handful of dried meat, and a slice of bread. Naya watched his hands as he worked, noting how patient and steady he remained. When he placed her portion on the table, he shifted his posture so she wouldn't feel watched while she ate. As she took her first bite, her gaze drifted toward the window. Her entire body went rigid. Colt looked outside. Fresh tracks. Not many, just two sets of hoof prints cutting through the shallow morning dust, but close enough that someone had ridden near the cabin before dawn. The prints continued toward the ridge, then vanished behind a cluster of rocks. Colt felt the familiar tightening in his stomach. The old instinct that warned him trouble was closing in. He didn't show alarm, but Naya sensed the change in him instantly. She stood, moved to the window, and studied the tracks with a focus that came from experience with being hunted. She spoke a single word in Apache, low and clipped. He didn't know its meaning, but the fear behind it was clear. "Someone looking for you?" Colt asked. She lifted her chin, anger flashing across her face for the first time since he met her. She pointed to the tracks, then to the arrow in his pocket. Then she pressed her palms together again, this time harder. The truth slid into place without needing translation. Whoever was tracking her would know the rule the moment they found out a man had caught her arrow. To them, the vow was binding. To them, Colt had already taken responsibility for her life. If he refused, there would be consequences. Colt stepped toward the door to examine the tracks more closely. "If they come here," he said, "I'll handle it." Naya stared at him, stunned that he didn't hesitate. No man had ever taken risk on her behalf without demanding something in return. Her breath shook with contained emotion, but she didn't let it show fully. Instead, she turned away, gathering her belongings in quick, tense movements, as if preparing to run again. Colt stopped her with a simple gesture. "You can stay. I'm not giving you up to anyone." She froze, shoulders lifting slightly, evidence of how deeply those words struck her. Then she sat again, slower this time, calmer. Her bow rested against her knee, not clenched in her fist. For the first time, she looked at him without scanning for threats behind him. He didn't need her gratitude. He didn't need her trust. What mattered was that she understood one thing clearly. He didn't follow laws written to control someone else's life. He followed the rules he made for himself, and none of those involved abandoning someone who had nowhere else to go. And as Naya studied him in the quiet morning light, her heartbeat eased, just enough for her to breathe without the panic that had driven her for days. Something in the room had shifted. Not safety, not comfort, not trust. Something simpler, a beginning. The morning sun rose fully by the time Colt finished checking the tracks near the ridge. When he returned to the cabin, the door stood slightly open, moving gently with each shift of wind. He paused, listening for anything that felt out of place. Inside, quiet sounds confirmed Naya was still there. Light footsteps, the scrape of pottery, measured breaths that tried to stay calm but held tension she couldn't hide. Colt stepped through the doorway. Naya had rearranged a small corner of the room. She collected the scattered pieces of broken clay from the floor and placed them in a neat row on the table, examining each fragment as if trying to decide whether any could be repaired. She wasn't cleaning for him. She was grounding herself, taking control of small tasks to steady her nerves. She didn't look up at first. Her focus stayed on the broken pottery, hands steady, movements deliberate. Only when Colt set his hat on the peg did she lift her eyes. "You saw more tracks," she said, her voice cautious, the English rough but clear. He nodded. "Two riders." "Not close now." Naya's jaw tightened at the word riders. She lowered her gaze again, running her thumb along the edge of a clay shard. She inhaled slowly, letting the breath settle before she spoke again. "What will you do if they come?" Colt didn't answer immediately. He crossed to the stove, added kindling, and lit a flame. Each motion was slow and controlled, giving him time to shape his thoughts. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he would not hand her over to strangers guided by laws he did not live by. "I'll deal with them," he said, without drawing first. She studied him for a long moment. That answer surprised her, though she hid it behind a neutral expression. Most men she had encountered in the past were quick to show force, eager to prove authority. Colt wasn't like that. He stood calm, not proud, not fearful, simply ready. Naya wrapped her arms around her ribs as she rose from the table. She tested her injured leg with caution, placing weight slowly. The bruise that spread along her side made her movements careful but resolute. She stepped outside into the morning air before Colt could ask where she was going. He followed her with his eyes, but didn't step after her. He understood the need for space. She walked toward the line of cottonwoods, keeping one hand on the trunk of a small tree when her balance wavered. The landscape stretched open in every direction, no cover except scattered shrubs and rocks. She took in every detail: the horizon, the slope of the canyon wall, the shadows cast by each ridge. She was checking escape routes, measuring the land the same way he'd done for years. After a few minutes, she returned to the cabin and motioned toward her leg. "I can still move fast if I must," she said, quiet but determined. Colt shook his head. "You shouldn't have to run again." Naya held his gaze longer than she had before. Something softened in her expression, not trust exactly, but recognition that he meant what he said. The day unfolded with a strange balance between distance and cooperation. Colt went to repair a loose section of the fence line behind the cabin. Naya followed at a distance, staying close enough to watch his work, but far enough to retreat quickly if trouble approached. She examined the land constantly, scanning the trail, listening for hoofbeats. After a while, she stepped closer and picked up stray branches lying near the fence. She stacked them neatly without being asked. She didn't seek praise. She simply contributed in the way she felt comfortable. Colt noticed a slight tremor in her hands when she reached for another branch. "You should rest," he said. "I rest when the danger is far," she replied. He accepted that without argument. She had lived through circumstances that forced her body to run on instinct long after exhaustion should have taken over. As the hours passed, the sun warmed the land, bringing out faint scents of dust and dry grass. Naya's posture slowly changed. Her shoulders eased whenever she realized Colt wasn't watching her constantly. Her breathing deepened as her mind shifted away from pure survival and towards simple tasks she could complete: sorting wood, gathering small stones from the creek bed, brushing dirt from her dress where the fabric had stiffened from old mud. Inside the cabin later that afternoon, she repaired the torn edge of her dress using a small bone needle she produced from pouch. Colt watched from the table as she worked, noticing the precision in her stitching. She had learned to mend clothing from someone who valued patience and careful craft. He didn't ask who had taught her. She didn't volunteer the answer. When Colt prepared food for them both, she approached the table without hesitation, though she still sat at the far side. She ate slowly, measuring the taste of each bite as if checking for danger. When she finished, she touched the rim of her cup and spoke softly. "Why are you alone here?" she asked. Colt didn't expect the question. Usually, strangers avoided asking about another person's past on the frontier. But Naya was speaking from a place of curiosity rather than judgment. "I lived with others once," he said. "Lost them. Didn't want to watch that happen again." Naya studied his face without pity. Instead, she looked as though she understood the kind of silence that came from personal loss. She nodded once, acknowledging his answer, and rose from the table. She walked to the small window near the stove and stared out at the canyon, her fingers gripping the edge of the frame. Colt watched her carefully. She wasn't frightened. She was thinking. When she finally turned back, her expression held a seriousness different from earlier fear. "You did not try to use the arrow," she said. "That tells me something." "What's that?" Colt asked. "You make your own choices. Not theirs. Not mine." She paused, her voice steady. "That is new for me." Colt didn't reply, but the meaning settled quietly in the room. As evening approached, the sky shifted to a deep red and the temperature dropped. Naya took her place near the stove, not by the door this time. She still kept her bow close, but her eyes no longer tracked every movement inside the cabin. Colt sat on the edge of his bed, cleaning his knife with careful strokes. He glanced at her once, noting how her posture leaned slightly toward the warmth of the stove, not rigid but alert in a gentler way. The day had changed something between them. Not trust, not friendship, but an understanding built from watching how the other moved, breathed, and reacted when danger brushed close. Both had spent years surviving through instincts shaped by loss. Both had lived alone long enough to forget what steady company felt like. And now, as the fire settled into soft embers, they occupied the same space without tension carving lines between them. It was not comfort, but it was no longer fear. It was the beginning of learning how to exist together without threat. Colt stepped outside just after dawn, the cool air touching his face with a crisp bite that signaled a colder day ahead. The sky lay pale and thin above the canyon, washed out by early light. As he walked toward the creek to check the trail, he noticed something in the dust that hadn't been there the day before. Fresh hoofprints. They curved around the edge of the cottonwoods and then veered toward the narrow rise overlooking his property. The impressions were sharp, the soil still slightly crumbled at the edges. Whoever passed through had done so recently, likely before sunrise. Colt crouched beside the tracks, studying their depth, spacing, and number with practiced judgment. 2 horses, not heavy, one ridden by someone who tilted slightly to the left, judging by the deeper imprint on that side. He didn't recognize the pattern, but he knew enough to understand what it meant. Someone had ridden nearby with purpose, not by chance. He brushed dirt over the tracks with the side of his hand, hiding them before heading back. Inside the cabin, Naya stood near the stove, her hair still damp from washing at the basin. The steam from the warming water fogged the lower edge of the window, smudging her reflection. She turned quickly when Colt entered, sensing his tension even before he spoke. "There were riders close," he said. "Not close enough to see the cabin, but they were headed this way." Naya straightened, her hand tightening around the edge of the table. She didn't panic. She had lived too long under pressure for panic to take over so easily. Instead, she took one steady breath, then walked outside without waiting for Colt's permission, scanning the land with sharp, trained eyes. She crouched low, inspecting the faint traces Colt hadn't covered completely. Broken grass, disturbed dirt, a stray pebble shifted from its place. She didn't touch any of it. She simply observed, her expression tightening. "Apache riders," she said quietly. "I know the spacing and the angle." Cole had expected that answer, but hearing it confirmed brought weight to the air around them. "They're tracking," she added. "Tracking you?" Colt asked. Naya nodded once, then pointed toward the rocky slope behind the cabin. "They think I broke a law. They think the arrow bound me without choice." Her voice didn't waver, but her hands showed the truth, a slight tremor she tried to hide by folding them against her chest. Colt studied her face. You want to hide? Or you want to confront them? She exhaled through her nose, gathering her thoughts before she answered. Neither. I want to choose where I stand. They will not allow that. Her honesty struck him with a clarity he didn't expect. She was not running anymore. She was preparing. He stepped closer. They won't force anything here. Naya looked up at him, her expression shifting in a way that wasn't gratitude, but acknowledgement of a man who meant what he said. She returned to the cabin after another glance across the ridge. Inside, she began organizing her belongings, moving with an urgency that wasn't chaotic but purposeful. She checked the fletching on her arrows, tightened the bowstring, and rewrapped a small leather cord around her wrist that carried meaningful beads, white, blue, and dark red, worn smooth by years of handling. Colt watched quietly, understanding that each movement carried emotional weight. He didn't interrupt. After several minutes, Naya set down her bow and approached the window. She stood there without speaking, as if absorbing the landscape, memorizing every detail in case she needed to act quickly. Colt stepped beside her, leaving enough distance so she wouldn't feel boxed in. You've been running a long time, he said. Her eyes stayed on the horizon. Since the night my family scattered. Arguments at home, elders making decisions I cannot accept. Then raids. Fear. I moved from place to place, always watched, always judged. She lowered her head. Freedom felt close, but rules follow even across open land. Colt listened without rushing her. She wasn't someone who shared easily. Every word she spoke came as a choice, not a slip. What about you? She asked. He thought carefully before answering. I came out here because I was tired of being responsible for things I couldn't fix. Men depended on me once. Some didn't make it back. I didn't want that on my shoulders anymore. Naya turned slightly toward him, her expression shifting from controlled caution to something more understanding. She recognized the weight behind his words, the unspoken guilt, the hesitation to lead anyone again. You left to survive, she said. So did you, Colt replied. They stood in silence for a moment, both facing the same window but seeing different histories behind the landscape. Later that afternoon, Naya stepped outside again, this time without tension in her steps. She walked toward the creek with a slow, measured pace, her eyes fixed on the water as she knelt near the edge. She dipped her hands in and let the coolness roll across her skin. She stayed crouched for a while, focusing on her breathing, regaining calm in a way that seemed familiar, a personal ritual for steadying her mind. Colt approached from behind, not wanting to startle her. They'll come back for another pass, he said. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. She stood, wiped her hands on the side of her dress, and faced him fully. When they arrive, they will ask a question you must answer. What question? Colt asked. If you claim the arrow. Colt felt the weight behind those words. He understood now why she reacted with dread when he caught it. The act wasn't just skill. It was symbolic, a decision she never intended him to make. I don't claim anything over you, he said firmly. She nodded. But they won't believe that easily. Colt thought through the possibilities. He didn't want conflict, but he also wouldn't surrender her autonomy to a rule he had never agreed to. We'll handle it when it comes, he said. Not before. Naya released the breath she'd been holding, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. As the sun lowered again, casting long shadows across the canyon, she moved her sleeping place to the opposite side of the room, closer to the stove, not pressed against the doorway. It wasn't a gesture of trust. Not yet. It was a sign that she no longer planned to run during the night. Colt observed the change quietly, understanding what it meant. Their situation had shifted, not into comfort, not into safety, but into a shared space where they would face whatever came next, together, even if they didn't speak that truth aloud. The wind changed direction by mid-morning, carrying a faint scent of horses from somewhere beyond the canyon's bend. Colt recognized it immediately. He had spent enough years tracking outlaws and cattle thieves to know the difference between old dust and fresh presence. He stepped onto the porch and narrowed his eyes at the ridge line. Nothing moved, but the land felt different, heavy, expectant. Inside the cabin, Naya paused mid-stitch as soon as she sensed Colt's focus shift. She didn't ask what he heard. Instead, she rose without sound, retrieved her bow, and positioned herself near the window. Her breathing steadied, the fear replaced with the readiness of someone who had survived many confrontations. A distant clatter broke the silence. Hooves on rock, not rushed, controlled. Colt stepped off the porch and scanned the horizon one more time before turning slightly toward the cabin door. "They're coming," he said. Naya's grip tightened on the bowstring. For a moment, her jaw clenched, but she forced her expression still. She wasn't afraid of the riders themselves. She was afraid of the rule they intended to enforce. The sound grew louder until finally 3 riders emerged from the canyon path, a small formation, but disciplined. Their horses were decorated with beadwork and leather wraps, identifying them as Apache men from Naya's own people. The man at the front rode a dark bay with a steady stride, his posture upright and authoritative. He was older, with deep lines carved across his face and a feather woven into his hair. The 2 behind him were younger, stern, and watchful. Colt didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he rested one hand on his belt, staying calm but prepared. The riders halted several yards from him. The leader's eyes swept over Colt before drifting toward the cabin door, where Naya stood partially in view. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by disappointment and something colder. Responsibility mixed with judgment. The leader spoke first. "She fired upon you." Colt didn't respond immediately. He let the sentence settle, recognizing it was not a question, but a statement laying the groundwork for what came next. "She did," Colt answered, voice steady. "But she didn't hit anything." "That does not matter," the leader said. "You caught the arrow." Naya stepped out a doorway, bow lowered but ready. Her voice came out controlled, though the strain behind it was visible. She spoke in Apache, the words sharp and clipped, her tone carrying defiance and explanation all at once. The leader listened without interrupting. When she finished, he shifted his attention back to Colt. "She claims you didn't try to take her, that you acted without intention," he said. "But rules are not shaped by intention. They are shaped by outcome." Colt's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way the man's tone packaged Naya's identity into a rule. "She stays or goes on her own terms," Colt replied. "No one decides for her." The younger riders stiffened at his words, hands moving subtly closer to their weapons. The leader raised a hand, stopping them. "She belongs to the vow until the arrow is acknowledged," the leader said. "Our law binds her life to the man who proves he can stop her strike without bloodshed. She becomes his responsibility." He paused, studying Colt's face. "If he rejects her, others have the right to claim vengeance for the broken right." Naya stepped beside Colt then, closer than she ever had. She didn't touch him, but the nearness itself was a declaration. She spoke again in her language, her voice lower, steadier, carrying a force that came from exhaustion and conviction. The leader listened carefully, nodding once before looking back at Colt. "She says you protected her dignity," he translated. "She says you gave her shelter without force. She says the choice is now hers." Colt didn't respond with pride or relief. He simply nodded once, acknowledging what she had declared. The leader's expression shifted, still stern, but less rigid. "If she chooses to remain here, then you must honor the vow fully. Not as ownership, as protection. She will not be hunted again if she stands with you." Naya inhaled sharply, her eyes darting to Colt. The truth of the moment hung heavy between them. Staying meant safety, but also commitment. Leaving meant danger, but freedom of movement. Colt didn't speak for her. She stepped forward instead. Her voice wavered only once. "I stay for my reasons, not for the vow." The leader considered her for a long, quiet moment. Then he turned to Colt. "If harm comes to her, we will know. If you mistreat her, we will return. But if you respect her choice, we respect yours." Colt met his eyes without flinching. "She's safe here." The leader dipped his head in acknowledgement. With a sharp whistle, he turned his horse. The younger men followed, the sound of hooves fading as they disappeared back toward the canyon's bend. When silence returned, Naya exhaled a breath she had held ever since she saw the riders. Her posture loosened, her bow lowered, her shoulders dropped. Colt remained beside her, giving her the space to feel whatever weight had just lifted. She looked at him, expression unreadable for a moment, then spoke softly. You stood for me without knowing what it demanded. I stood because it was right, Colt said. Naya swallowed hard, the tension behind her eyes shifting into something deeper, recognition mixed with fragile relief. She looked toward the ridge where the riders had vanished, then back at the cabin. This place is mine now, too, she said quietly, as if testing the truth aloud for the first time. And when she stepped inside ahead of him, she kept the door open long enough for him to follow. A gesture small in action, yet enormous in meaning. A choice made by her alone. The days that followed the rider's departure unfolded with a steadiness neither Colt nor Naya expected. The air held a different weight now. Not lighter, not safer, but clearer. The threat of pursuit had faded, replaced by the responsibility of sharing space without the tension that once shadowed every movement. Colt woke early each morning, long before the sun reached the crest of the ridge. He pushed open the cabin door quietly, careful not to disturb Naya, and stepped outside into the crisp air. The land was silent except for distant birds and the slow shifting of the creek. He carried his tools to the corral, repairing weak rails and tightening loose ties. He preferred routine. It gave structure to days that might otherwise feel empty. Naya rose a short while later. She no longer waited by the door, her posture rigid and ready to flee. Instead, she washed her face at the basin, adjusted the leather strap at her waist, and tied her hair back with steady fingers. Her movements were deliberate, not frantic, shaped by habit rather than fear. When she stepped outside, she walked not to check escape routes, but to begin her own tasks. She paused near the edge of the small garden Colt had attempted to cultivate months before. Most of the plants had died from neglect. She knelt and brushed soil away from a wilted stalk, studying the ground's dryness. Without asking permission, she began clearing out dead roots. She had tended crops in her childhood, learning from her mother how to coax life from harsh land. The motion brought a calmness to her eyes Colt hadn't seen before. He noticed from the fence line. Those won't yield anything, he said, not dismissively but with simple honesty. They might, she answered, if cared for. He watched her hands work the soil. The certainty in her voice surprised him not because she seemed confident, but because she allowed herself to claim authority over something. It meant she saw the land as a place she intended to remain. Throughout the day, their paths crossed naturally. Naya carried buckets of water from the creek, careful with each step so nothing spilled. Colt chopped firewood in steady, rhythmic motions. Neither hovered over the other. They moved like two people learning to share responsibility without overstepping boundaries. During the afternoon, Naya approached Colt with a small bundle of dried plants she had gathered. These help with swelling, she said, touching her rib where the bruise still lingered. She offered him some as well, placing them gently on the table. Colt nodded, accepting the gesture. The simple act of sharing knowledge altered the atmosphere between them. Less guarded, more practical. Later, she began sorting through the scattered items on the shelves, organizing tools, stacking tin cups, and folding cloth strips left from old repairs. Colt noticed she never threw anything away. Every fragment, every scrap held potential for a new purpose. He admired that about her silently. That evening, after supper, Naya surprised him by stepping outside first. She stood near the porch, gazing at the horizon where the sky shifted from deep orange to muted purple. Colt joined her, leaning lightly against the railing. "There's quiet here," she said. "There is," Colt replied. She turned her head slightly, considering him. Quiet is not always peaceful, but this one feels different. Colt looked out at the land. Better than the noise out there. Naya's lips pressed together in agreement. She didn't smile, but there was a softness in her expression he hadn't seen before. As the air cooled, she returned inside and knelt beside her bedroll. This time, she didn't place it near the stove or the door. She spread it across the floor on the opposite side of his cot, still separate but no longer isolated. She did it without hesitation, as if the decision had been waiting for the right moment. Colt noticed. He didn't comment, respecting the significance of the shift. Before lying down, she removed a small woven band from her belongings and untied it carefully. Inside were several pieces of polished stone, each carved with a simple symbol. She arranged them beside her bedroll in a quiet, intentional line. Colt observed from a table. "Something important?" he asked. "They belong to my father," she said. "I place them wherever I stay, to remember that I come from somewhere." He nodded slowly. "Good thing to hold on to." Naya touched one of the stones lightly. Her fingers lingered longer than usual. "Do you miss them?" Colt asked, choosing his words carefully. She released a long, steady breath. "I miss the people they were before fear changed everything." Her answer settled between them, honest and heavy, yet not burdened by despair. Colt didn't push further. He understood too well the difference between grieving someone gone and grieving someone changed. When she finally lay down, her breathing slowed in a way he hadn't heard since the night she arrived. She seemed anchored, for now at least. Colt extinguished the lantern and stretched across his cot. He listened to the night sounds outside, the distant rustle of wind, the soft creaking of the cabin settling, the faint crackle of the dying fire. Across the room, Naya slept without clutching her bow. For the first time since her arrival, the cabin did not feel like a shelter for a frightened stranger. It felt like a place beginning to hold two people who had stopped running quite so fast. And though neither said it, both felt the quiet shift settling around them. A new rhythm, built on shared ground, not obligation. The next morning broke with a thin veil of clouds, masking the early sunlight. The air held a faint chill, the kind that hinted at a change in weather. Colt stepped outside first, boots pressing into the damp earth as he checked the sky with a practiced eye. The wind moved differently today, slow, dragging across the canyon as if carrying a message that hadn't yet arrived. Behind him, the cabin door opened gently. Naya emerged with her hair tied back loosely, strands falling over her shoulders. She walked with a steadiness absent in her first days here, though she still scanned the open land before fully stepping off the porch. Old habits shaped her movements, but her posture no longer carried the rigid tension of someone expecting danger at every turn. She approached the small garden she had cleared the day before and knelt to test the soil again. Colt watched as she pressed her fingers into the ground, turning it carefully. Her expression held concern, not worry. She was thinking about the seasons, the earth's condition, the work ahead. It was the expression of someone considering a future, not merely surviving the present. "You think anything will grow in this soil?" Colt asked. "It will," she said firmly. "But it needs time." He nodded, appreciating her certainty. Naya wasn't guessing. She was evaluating, planning, deciding what this land could become under her care. They spent the morning working in quiet coordination. Colt repaired a section of the roof, hammering loose shingles back into place while Naya gathered herbs from near the creek. She moved with purpose, filling a small pouch with leaves she identified by scent and texture. When she returned, she spread them on a cloth inside the cabin, sorting them into neat rows. "These ease pain," she explained, "and these help with fever. You should have them stored." Colt looked at the herbs, impressed by her knowledge. "Did someone teach you all this?" "My mother," she replied. "She believed every place had what you needed if you knew how to see it." Colt's gaze softened. "You learned well." Her eyes lowered briefly, touched by the acknowledgement, though she said nothing in response. As the day wore on, Naya's steps grew lighter. She moved between the cabin and the yard as if mapping out the space as her own. She hung her water pouch on a peg by the door, placed her carved stones near the window where the light reached them, and folded her repaired dress sleeves with care before storing them on a shelf Colt seldom used. He noticed each detail quietly. By late afternoon, Naya approached Colt with the arrow he had caught weeks earlier, the one she had avoided touching until now. She held it between her palms, not as a threat, but as a burden she had finally decided to confront. Colt stopped stacking wood when he saw her. She stood with her shoulders squared, expression serious. "I have something to say," she began, her voice low yet unwavering. "Not because of the vow, because of what I choose." He set the wood aside, giving her his full attention. "When I came here," she said, "I was running from people who claimed my decisions were not mine. They believed old rules outweighed the life I wanted." Her fingers tightened around the arrow. But here, you did not treat me as bound. You gave me space to breathe. You let me choose how to live each day. She took a breath, gathering her thoughts before continuing. I did not want to carry this arrow anymore. Colt waited, sensing the significance of her next words. I choose to stay, Naya said. Not because of the tradition. Not because I must. Because this place feels like somewhere I can build again. Colt felt something shift inside him. He wasn't a man given to strong displays of emotion, but her words settled deep, steady, and undeniable. He met her gaze and saw no hesitation there. Only a quiet certainty shaped by days spent learning each other. What do you want me to do with it? He asked softly. Naya looked at the arrow, then back at him. Destroy it. So nothing outside this place can claim my path again. He took the arrow from her hands, holding it with care. She stepped back, watching as he walked toward the fire pit. He set the arrow across the stones and lit a small flame beneath it. The fire grew slowly, warming the wood until it cracked. The feathers curled, the shaft darkened, and soon there was little left except glowing embers. Naya watched every moment, her eyes reflecting the firelight. When the arrow collapsed completely, she exhaled, a long, controlled breath that released a weight she had carried for far too long. Colt approached her again. It's done. She nodded, but her gaze lingered on the embers. I never thought I'd see that day. Now you have, he said gently. Naya lifted her chin, something resolute forming in her expression. She reached forward and briefly, lightly touched Colt's sleeve, an unspoken thanks, an acknowledgement of what he'd helped her reclaim. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the land in muted gold, Naya placed her bedroll near the foot of his cot, not out of obligation, but as a sign of belonging. She settled there without waiting for him to comment. Colt extinguished the lantern and lay down. The room felt different, warmer, grounded, shared. And for the first time in many years, Colt drifted into sleep, not with the burden of solitude, but with the knowledge that another person had chosen to remain beside him of her own will. It was a quiet shift, but it changed everything. The last remnants of the burned arrow cooled overnight, leaving the fire pit ringed with gray ash and faint black streaks. When Colt stepped outside, just after dawn, he stood over the remnants for a long moment. The gesture had meant something important to Naya, freedom from a rule she never asked for, and he wanted to be sure every piece was gone. He stirred the ash with a stick until it broke into fine powder that scattered across the ground with the wind. Behind him, the cabin door creaked softly. Naya stepped out wearing a leather wrap she had repaired the night before. Her eyes drifted to the pit, scanning it closely. Seeing nothing but dust and char, she released a slow breath, not in fear or sorrow, but in acceptance. Colt nodded toward the empty fire pit. Nothing left to bind you. Her gaze shifted to him, steady and clear. Good. She did not linger on the ashes. Instead, she walked toward the corral where the old mare stood waiting for feed. Naya reached out, brushing the horse's neck with careful strokes. The mare leaned into the contact, a sign of trust Naya had earned slowly over days of patience. Colt watched the interaction with quiet appreciation. Animals sense things about people that humans rarely saw first: intent, calm, sincerity. Naya had all three. Colt joined her at the fence. She listens to you. She knows I won't harm her, Naya replied. Her words carried more meaning than she intended. Colt heard it, but he let it pass without comment. The morning unfolded with an ease neither had experienced before. Naya prepared a broth from the herbs she dried the previous day, adding strips of meat Colt had smoked earlier that week. The cabin filled with a warm, earthy scent. She worked with an attentiveness shaped by years of living through scarcity, using every resource carefully. While she cooked, Colt repaired a broken latch on the back door, glancing over his shoulder now and then just to take in the unfamiliar feeling of another person sharing his home without tension. When they sat to eat, Naya tasted the broth first, nodding at its warmth. Colt took a spoonful and felt the heat spread through his chest. It was the first meal in a long time that didn't feel like fuel for survival, but nourishment from someone who intended to remain. After breakfast, Naya approached Colt with a firm expression. "Show me the land," she said. "All of it." He didn't question the request. He retrieved his coat. She grabbed her bow, and together they walked past the corral, beyond the cottonwoods, and toward the open ridge. Naya studied everything. The slope of the hills, the dry creek bed, the narrow trails branching off between brush. She wasn't planning escape routes anymore. She was learning the territory as someone invested in its future. "This ground is strong," she observed, "but the soil near your garden is tired. It needs rest." Colt listened. "What does it need?" "Time, water, and someone who cares about it." He nodded, understanding she wasn't just talking about the soil. They climbed the ridge, stopping at a point where the canyon spread wide below them. The land stretched for miles, rough, unforgiving, but honest. From this height, Naya could see everything. The line of the creek, the distant trail that led toward Apache hunting grounds, and the path where the riders had disappeared days earlier. She stood with her arms crossed, the wind catching her hair. For the first time, she didn't look nervous standing in the open. She looked rooted, as if claiming space she had long been denied. Colt watched her, recognizing the shift. When they made their way back to the cabin, Naya crouched beside a cluster of tall grass near the fence. She parted the blades carefully to reveal a fresh track, narrow, soft-edged, unmistakably from a deer. "We can hunt here tomorrow," she said. "The herd is moving close." Colt crouched beside her to examine the print. "You know the signs well." "My father taught me. He said the land speaks if you're quiet enough to hear it." She rose, brushing dust from her palms. "You listen the same way," she added. "Different land, different lessons, but you hear them." The comparison surprised Colt more than he let show. He wasn't used to being understood through such simple observations. As evening approached, they spent time inside the cabin organizing supplies. Naya arranged herbs into neat bundles, while Colt sharpened tools that had gone dull. They worked without speaking, the silence warm rather than thick. Their routines no longer ran parallel. They intertwined, adjusting to each other's patterns naturally. After supper, Naya pulled a wooden bead from her pouch, one painted with a faded blue pigment. She held it between her fingers, turning it slowly. Colt recognized it as one of the stones she kept near her bed, but noticed this one had been set aside deliberately. "This bead belonged to my sister," she said softly. "She carried it for strength." Colt's eyes met hers. "Where is she now?" Naya looked toward the darkening horizon. "Alive, I hope. Our family scattered, but she is strong. Stronger than I was." Colt shook his head. "Strength isn't a contest. You survived. That counts." She considered his words for a moment, then set the bead on the table. "I want to keep this here," she said. "So I remember why I keep moving forward." He nodded. "Then it belongs where you see it every day." She left it in a place of quiet honor on the shelf beside the lantern. Later, as they settled into their beds, Naya wrapped her blanket around herself and stared at the ceiling for several minutes before speaking. "You helped me break from something that held power over my life for too long," she said. "I didn't expect that from a stranger." "I didn't do it for reward," Colt replied. "I did it because it needed doing." Naya shifted slightly, her breathing evening out. "I know." The lantern dimmed until only the glowing coals from the stove lit the room. When Naya finally closed her eyes, her face carried a calm that hadn't existed before she stepped through Colt's door. She was no longer simply protected. She was choosing to build something new. Colt lay awake a while longer, aware of the quiet transformation happening between them. Not forced, not sudden, but real. Outside, the night wind swept across the ridge, carrying away the last traces of past. Inside, two people who had lived too long in fear rested for the first time with the faint possibility of a shared future. The morning of the decision arrived quietly, with a soft light spreading across the valley and settling on the cabin roof like a calm announcement of what the day would bring. Colt stepped outside first, as he often did, but his movements carried a slower rhythm. Something felt different, steadier, more resolved. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Naya emerged a few minutes later. She had taken time to braid her hair neatly, threading a thin leather strip through the end to keep it from unraveling. Her dress, though worn, had been washed and mended with precision. She stood on the porch and looked at Colt with an expression that held no uncertainty. "I want to speak today," she said quietly. He nodded. "I'm listening." She moved a few steps into the open yard, facing the ridge where the riders had appeared days ago. Her gaze held firm, not searching for danger this time, but acknowledging the place where her past had tried to reclaim her. When she finally turned back to Colt, her shoulders were relaxed, and her voice was steady. "I've lived by other people's decisions for most of my life," she said. "The tribe had rules. My family had expectations. Every choice I made was judged." She paused, drawing a breath that seemed lighter than those she had taken before. "But here I found space. You did not take from me. You did not speak for me. You gave me time to stand again." Colt's chest tightened slightly, not from fear or conflict, but from the depth of what she was offering. "You owe me nothing," he said. "I know," she replied. "That is why I choose this." She walked toward him, her steps unhurried. When she reached him, she stopped close enough that he felt the warmth of her presence through the cool morning air. "I want to be your wife," Naya said. "Not because tradition demands it. Not because I am bound. Because I choose to stay beside you." The words landed with a weight Colt didn't expect. He had lived years without imagining companionship again. Quiet days, predictable nights, no shared path. But Naya had slowly carved a place in his life with each day she stayed, each decision she made, each breath she took without fear. He swallowed once, steadying himself. "If that's what you want, then I accept." Naya's expression softened, a shift subtle yet unmistakable. Not a smile, but something deeper, peace, finally untangled from the pressure of survival. Colt stepped back long enough to fetch something from the cabin. When he returned, he held a thin leather cord he had braided during quiet moments when he thought she wasn't watching. He hadn't planned to give it to her for any ceremonial purpose. He had made it simply because he wanted her to have something created by his hands. He held it out to her. "I made this. If you want it." She touched the cord gently, running her fingers over each tight, even braid. Her eyes glimmered with quiet recognition of what the gesture meant. A promise built not on vows or rituals, but on shared work and mutual respect. "I accept," she said. They stood facing each other in the open yard, the land witnessing their decision. There was no audience, no chanting, no formal blessing. Only two people who understood loss and had chosen not to walk through life alone anymore. Naya tied the cord around her wrist, making a simple knot that held securely. Then she reached out and placed her hand lightly on Colt's chest. "Now we start." Colt covered her hand with his own. Together, the afternoon unfolded with a quiet celebration shaped by their shared work. Colt prepared a small feast using the last of the cured meat and some wild herbs Naya had gathered. She ground the herbs with practiced hands, releasing a fragrant aroma that filled the cabin. They ate outside under the shade of the cottonwoods, listening to the wind move across the grass. Naya told him stories from her childhood, how she learned to track by watching her father, how she practiced stitching with leftover scraps from her mother's baskets. Colt shared memories of the first ranch he ever worked on, the long days of riding across open plains, the partners he had lost but still respected. They exchanged no vows beyond the ones already spoken. Their connection did not need complicated words. As evening settled, Naya moved her belongings inside the cabin, placing her stones on a shelf near Colt's tools. She rolled her bed into a tighter bundle and set it near his cot, not as a guest, but as a wife ready to build a life beside him. When a lantern was lit, the warm glow illuminated both their places on the floor, now close enough that the distance between them no longer carried the same meaning. Naya lay down first, resting her head on a folded blanket. Colt settled beside her, neither touching nor separating themselves. They breathed the same quiet air, feeling the shift that bound them not by law, not by fear, but by mutual choice. Before sleep took her, Naya whispered, "I am home." Colt closed his eyes with a calm he had not felt in years. "And you're safe." Outside the cabin, the night unfolded without tension or danger. No riders, no threats, just a steady breeze moving across the land they now shared. Their story ended not with noise or triumph, but with two people choosing each other in the stillness of a peaceful night. A union forged by respect, strengthened by shared hardship, and sealed by the simple act of staying.